Hi, my name is John, and I'm a recovering theologian. And I wanted to say a little bit today about Soren Kierkegaard's stages on life's way and synthesize that a bit with the threefold path or threefold way that appears in the medieval mystical tradition. So this is kind of on Kierkegaard, and it's kind of on that spiritual theology tradition, but it's really kind of combining the two of them together. And I kind of want to do that because I find that a figure like Kierkegaard really connects with some readers, and he can actually be a way into kind of insight into material that's strange to some of us, and vice versa. Some of us really are drawn to that ancient contemplative tradition, and it kind of clicks with us, but we kind of don't see how Kierkegaard might speak into that. So it seemed to me like that creating a little bit of a constructive synthesis between the two could be helpful. So I want to say right out of the gate, as just a quick caveat, that this is not exactly, not in some sense, not really at all a reading of Kierkegaard, at least according to his intention. I'm not saying that Soren is sort of setting forth this was his intention, but rather to say that actually you can draw on his insights as a kind of entry point into the contemplative via, or vice versa. So, okay, that was all just sort of caveats and introduction, as is my custom. So now on to the substance of the matter. So let me just start with a review of the three via in the Way of Perfection, as it's often sometimes called, although that's the name of the third one, so that's confusing. But we'll call it the monastic contemplative journey, as it were. Okay, so the three basic moments, the three elements are the way of purgation via purgativa, the way of illumination, the via illuminativa, and the way of union or way of perfection via unitiva or via perfectiva. And these basic moments, again, they're chronological in a certain sense, but it's also a logical ordering in the sense that the purgative practices continue throughout one's Christian life, and anticipations of union occur even during seasons of purgation. So you don't want to think of them in a rigidly chronological way, but it is roughly stages or phases, states in the Christian life according to the monastic tradition. I'll kind of draw a little bit on Evagrius here as one of the earliest sort of articulators of this basic structure. I mean, it appears earlier in origin and even has pre-Christian antecedents in terms of certain structural insights. But I want to draw on Evagrius just because he really kind of captures it really well. So the purgative moment, or the moment, it's not moment, right? It's practicae in the West. The practical or purgative phase or stage is the one that emphasizes the intentional practice of asceticism, of removing things from one's life, goods that one has come to have a disordered relationship to, right? Think a Lenten fast. You're not fasting from food because it's evil. You're fasting from food because it's good, but your relationship to it has become disordered. And so you're actually having less of it than maybe is best, right? Because for a season you recognize it's time to have, because you've had more, now it's time to have less, right? In order to hopefully get back to a place of moderation, of a rightly ordered life. So purgation is that life of repentance, of stepping away, of fasting, of discipline, right? Asceticism, right? These are the kinds of patterns that fit the purgative. But the purgative is not an end in itself. You're not just purging yourself of these things as just, oh, now I'm a holy person. No. It's to open oneself up to have a clarity of mind, a clarity of body, right? So that one is able now to receive the insight that comes in the illuminative way. That's that second aspect, right? So the illuminative journey is the moving towards a kind of awareness of what it is that God is doing in the created world, right? So it's kind of still oriented towards the creaturely world, but it's kind of that positive movement back to actually seeing that God is in all things, which is hard to see when you're just stuffing your mouth full of all things, right? You have to step away to kind of see, God is at work in all these things, right? So that illumination, right? And then the moving towards union is the actual kind of crossing of that boundary into not only God as the one who is working in creation, but to have a genuine, deep, personal, intimate encounter with God, God's self, in God's self, who God is, not just what God has done for us, right? That subtle distinction, right? And which comes as sheer gift and is its own kind of way of living that, of course, helps us to then be a more joyful, free kind of life, even in the midst of purgation that we continue to do. So that's that basic review of those three moments. So then we have Kierkegaard on the other side, who talks, and now these don't line up exactly. You'll see how it goes together in a second. So Kierkegaard talks about the aesthetic kind of mode of existence, the ethical mode of existence, and the religious mode of existence, which has some different aspects that we'll get into in a moment. So again, these don't line up exactly. You actually can think of them as a transition, one from the other, which I think will hopefully be clear as I walk through Kierkegaard here. So the aesthetic existence is life in the immediacy. It's just being in the moment and enjoying pleasure. What brings one pleasure, insight, enjoyment. This can be base pleasures of, drug, sex, rock and roll, etc., right? Or more, rarefied pleasure of poetry and the arts, etc., right? But it's still all aesthetic at the end. It's still oriented towards what is pleasing, what is enjoyable, what brings one delight as one is, right, in the moment, right? And the movement from the aesthetic to the ethical, which is the moment of requirement and of repentance and of a seriousness of one's moral life and character, right? A pursuit of an ethical ideal. That's that second stage as he says it out. You can kind of see that the purgative way is that transition from the aesthetic to the ethical, right? It's that movement from being oriented just to the enjoyment of life to recognizing, actually, I need to step away from some of that through purgation so that I can actually live a morally upright life, to actually have a life of virtue, right? Which is where the ethical lives. As Kierkegaard puts it, the ethical is the transition. It's the life of repentance that we never really leave, in a certain sense. We're always in the ethical. We're always moving, as it were, from the aesthetic to the religious, right? The religious is where we're trusting totally in the grace of God, right? And so you can see how the illuminative then is the movement from a merely ethical existence, right? A merely ethical existence, this is where I did Kierkegaard, right? A merely ethical existence, right? That's just oriented towards being a good person. And if all you ever do is purge yourself, you can get stuck there, right? So you can kind of see then illumination as the divine light and guidance, the journey of discernment to bring us out of merely doing the right thing all the time and avoiding the evil, right? Which is where you can get stuck in the purgation all the time, right? Illumination draws us then into a trust and enjoyment of God, right? To see God in all things, right? To even start to move beyond the way that ethical can tend to look down on the aesthetic as not very virtuous. You can actually start to appreciate the little things in life again, because the illumination enters in and we begin to discern how God is at work in the world, right? So there's a kind of returning to the enjoyment of the world on some level that comes through that illumination that moves us beyond merely the ethical mode of existence into the religious mode of existence. And the religious mode of existence, according to Kierkegaard, is one that has this, quote, leap of faith, which again is misleading if we think of it as jumping into a cavern or something like that. It's often how it's described in the English-speaking world, but it's actually a dance language that he's using. It's a leap of faith, right? One jumps and then one keeps going. He means it as a ballet move in the context of where he first uses that term. So there's this leap, this freedom to be a little bit less than fully grounded, because one is moving into trusting the way that God is at work, and one is not going to make oneself the perfectly virtuous person, but rather one is going to jump into this reckless free life of God following Jesus, who is the perfectly ethical person, and yet in a certain sense completely turns upside down and undermines all our usual ethical standards, right? It seems to work at total odds with what we would expect, right? And so that religious mode of existence is one that the Illumination can kind of bring us into as we move beyond just figuring out what the right thing is all the time, right? Now, again, there's different levels on the religion category. Kind of has a religion A and religious B, right? Religious A, religious B. You can have religious insight, right? You can see things from a religious perspective without actually fully living as religious, right? But then it, in a way, kind of can undermine it. And this is what can happen if you just kind of get stuck and not move all the way into the unitive, right? So that's why the unitive is sort of names that transition from religious as a kind of objective knowledge of the truth. You can sort of see that religion, that grace is true, that it isn't up to me and all of my moral goodness, but actually up to God and following God wherever God leads, right? You can know that intellectually, right? You can grasp it, and Kierkegaard himself says this is kind of where I'm at. He says this at the end of the Stages of Life Way book, and you see it in the preface to Practice Christianity when he says, Anticlimactus here, he says he's the editor, right? He really, he's a real Christian, right? He's really going to present the ideal of Christianity, right? I'm just kind of the editor here who's just kind of saying, hey, if you read this guy, you'll really see like what Christianity calls forth, the scandal that Christianity is. And Kierkegaard wants to say, like, yeah, I have the insight enough to kind of see it, right? But am I fully in it? No, right? And you can see the way of union, right? That sort of third and final moment is the one that moves us from a sort of attunement to what religion's all about to really genuinely existing as a religious person, one who lives according to grace, doesn't just understand or grasp that the Christian life is the life of grace, but genuinely lives according to a fully graced existence, so that, as he puts it again in the preface to the Practice of in Christianity, that we would learn to resort to grace even in our use of grace, that we would not just sort of, grace is there, good, cheap grace style, right? Hey, grace is there, so we don't have to worry about the ethical anymore, but actually that grace becomes a way of life, right? So that's the kind of basic sort of constructive synthesis I wanted to sketch. I hope it's clear enough. Again, maybe I made it more vague than clear, but I hope it would be a little bit helpful to kind of see how, there's these three stages in the monastic tradition, and then Kierkegaard has these three stages. They don't line up exactly, but you can kind of see, because of Kierkegaard's mode of indirect communication, he, instead of kind of speaking from within sort of mystical maturity, as most of the monastic writers do, they're mostly people who are living in the unitive way, looking back and giving advice to those along the way. Kierkegaard, through his method, sort of adopts the perspective of the aesthetic and tries to undermine it from within, adopts the ethical and sort of undermines it from within. And by setting them opposed to each other, he's pressing us on into a religious perspective. And even there, not claiming to kind of know it from within, but just trying to recognize what's at stake in our Christian faith. So he's able to kind of present, I think, some of these great spiritual insights in a more indirect, paradoxical, dialectical, and palatable sometimes way, and almost kind of not always as an insider discourse. Sometimes the mystical tradition can be a sort of insider discourse that you have to figure out. And Kierkegaard can kind of speak from a very different angle, right? Almost from outside the mystical tradition, but bearing witness to it, right? So if Kierkegaard helps you as a way in to the mystical, great. If the mystical helps you to have a way in to figuring out what Kierkegaard's up to, either way, I hope that there can be some benefit from thinking through some of this synthesis of two things. Okay, hope that helped. Make sure to like and subscribe per usual. Don't forget to check out the Fresh Text podcast. Just look for Fresh Text on any of the major podcast apps. And yeah, see you later. Bye.